If we could just bottle what we've had this weekend, especially today, and be able to kind of carry that over. But at least for a while, we're going to have that, right?
Yeah, bro, we'll have it. We'll have it tomorrow. We'll be in the 80s tomorrow, and we have a rain chance going into tomorrow night into the early hours on Tuesday. But we should be clearing out by early Tuesday morning around 8 a.m. and dealing with lots of sunshine, and then by Wednesday we'll be back into the 70s, and by Easter weekend we'll be in the 80s. We do have a slight rain chance Saturday morning, but Sunday looking dry, just lots of cloud coverage. And then going into the work week next week, we got some rain chances, but temperature-wise, we'll be in the 80s and upper 70s Tuesday and Wednesday.
Yeah, let's keep that next week. Let's just kind of push that out of the mind right now, and I'll stay with the temperatures we got
Focus
this
on
week.
the good.
That's right. Focus on the good and the sunshine that we have this week. Yes. Thanks, Lainey. Thanks, Trevor. Thanks for watching Way 31 News at 10. Remember, you can stay up to date anytime at our website, waytv.com. Stay tuned. Law Call is next.
This is Way 31 Law Call.
Good evening and welcome to Way 31 Law Call. I'm Sharon Doviet. Tonight it's Ask Us Anything night, so call in your questions whether you've got trouble on the job, trouble in your marriage, trouble with a car wreck, damage to your home from recent storms. The 31 Law Call number 256-536-0077. You can call in and be live on the air, or you can text us your question to that same number. You can also email us. You can email any day of the week. You send it to lawcall@waytv.com, and when we get to a show that's on point, we pull them out. We've got some of your email questions for you tonight. Getting started tonight, Heath Brooks is here from Timberlake League. Brooks, good to have you here.
Good to be here on this after this beautiful, beautiful day we had today.
Perfect, perfect. Yep. So as we get some of your calls locked in, we've got tonight's You Make the Law Call video. So we pull something off of Facebook and take a look at it, and you decide who you think, okay, that happened fast, we're going to play it again. So who's at fault here? It looks like no signals. Folks are just moving all over the road and passing each other with no indications of what they're going to do.
There's a lot going on here. There's a lot going on here. It looks like, so whenever you're going to change lanes, you got to change lanes with the signal so that somebody knows that you're changing lanes. It doesn't look like that happened when they were attempting to change a lane. And then also, you know, it looks like they slammed on their brakes when the car in the front, the black car, slammed on their brakes when they realized that they weren't in the right lane. So I'm suspecting that maybe that vehicle was texting and driving or under the influence of something. But certainly, even if you're the car behind them, you got to be aware of a potential hazard in front of you. But in that kind of situation, it looks like the vehicle in front will probably be the one that was responsible.
Okay.
Yeah.
How many of the cases that you're handling these days deal with somebody who's been texting, who's texting and driving? A lot of them?
More than I would like to see. More than I would like to see. You know, one of the things that we see is that particularly with texting and driving, you know, you're looking down at your phone. For whatever reason, you start moving a little bit to the right, and then you realize you're moving to the right, but you got to get that answer in, and you move back to your left, and then all of a sudden, you know, you're in the ditch somewhere, or a car stopped in front of you or something. You know, it happens a lot, and the thing about it is you don't just have access to somebody's cell phone records or texting records. So what we have to do is if we suspect that somebody's been texting and driving and caused a wreck, then a lot of times we'll have to file a lawsuit so that we can get the power of the court to get the cell phone records.
Yeah.
And then we can subpoena those cell phone records, which is what we do routinely. And, you know, just the other day, I subpoenaed some cell phone records and found out somebody was in the midst of a text while the collision occurred. So
I don't get those kind of records when I'm subpoenaing records for phones. I get, you know, text messages and phone records for divorce cases and family cases.
Right.
Can you just read it yourself, or do you have to have an expert interpret what it is that's going on with what you receive?
It depends on the records. Sometimes I can look at the records. I can look at the time. They're in international time, so uniform standard international time. So we're about 6 hours, I think, ahead. So you kind of got to do your own math there, and a lot of times it's confusing. We do routinely have an expert who will evaluate phone records. Sometimes, particularly if you're dealing with a commercial case and a tractor trailer driver, there may be multiple numbers on the same account. And so sometimes one of those numbers is an iPad or another device, and there may have been video streaming during the time of the wreck. I have sadly seen that.
Oh, no.
But yeah, so we'll hire an expert to evaluate the records, and then they can triangulate. You can use this complicated mathematical triangulation to determine exactly where the cell phone was located at the time of the incident.
Okay.
You know,
And
so
you can even know how fast it was going, right?
how fast the cell phone was moving, you know, the speed at which it stopped. I mean, there's all kinds of information you can get once you can, you know, if you find somebody who has that information.
That's good proof.
Sure.
We've got a caller on line 2 with a question about a car accident. Hi, caller. Thanks for calling in tonight. What's your question? Hi, is it James? Hi, James. What's your question tonight?
Well, I had an accident coming up a mountain. My brakes went out on my vehicle,
Okay.
and I made it all but the last curve, and it was going so fast I couldn't make it around the last curve, and it slid inside the mountain.
Right.
It broke my back, my wife's back, broke her ribs, collapsed a lung, brain bleed, and broke her left shoulder.
Goodness, James, I'm glad y'all
Good
are still
gosh.
with us. So, do you think something went wrong with the vehicle? Are you looking for what you can do about that?
Yeah, all I had was liability insurance, and they said my wife. I mean, I know that I wasn't covered, but my passengers. I thought my passengers would be covered, but
Yeah.
they say they ain't.
Well, you know, there's a lot to unpack there. When you have insurance on your car, you can look at a lot of different potential solutions. The first I think of immediately is that if your brakes failed, and if you had anybody do any work on your brakes recently, then that could be a situation where that person or company could be responsible in the event that, you know, there was a bad repair done. And I don't know that that was the case. I'm just saying that could be an option. The second option is, depending upon what year your car is, if your car had a recall or something had been wrong with the brakes, and the company who manufactured your car knew, you may have a claim against the company that manufactured the car, and called a products liability claim, where the product, which was your car, was not manufactured right. And so because of that failure to manufacture something right, it caused you and your wife injury. If you get to your insurance on your car, basically when you buy automobile insurance on your vehicle, you get 4 basic types. One is called liability coverage, and that's what you have. And that just means that if you mess up and you cause somebody else to get injured or cause property damage to somebody else's vehicle, then your insurance is going to come and they're going to pay for the damages that you caused, whether that's to another person's body or whether that's to their property. The second kind of insurance that you would have is called collision or comprehensive coverage, which basically doesn't have anything to do with who's at fault for the wreck. It's just a type of coverage that is going to pay for the damages to your car or to someone, no matter what happens. Even if a deer runs out in front of you, then your collision coverage will cover your property damage. The third is medical payments coverage, which basically is health insurance with your car insurance. It pays your medical bills, doesn't matter who's at fault. And the fourth is uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage, which means that you got hurt by somebody, they were negligent, they caused the wreck, and they didn't have any insurance, and your insurance company will step in and pay those damages. In your situation, though, James, your liability coverage is not going to cover someone who is actually in your household. That will likely be excluded within your policy. I would encourage you, though, to have a lawyer review your policy of insurance to see if there is any avenue of recovery you may have.
Good. That's very interesting. We got this email question in from Scott. Scott had written in, I just had my land surveyed. A few months ago, my neighbor built a 40 by 60 barn, 26 feet inside my property. I didn't know where the property line was for sure until this survey was run. I offered to sell or lease him the land that the barn sits on, but he claims because he thought the property was his for over 20 years, it is his. Okay.
You know, we see these
landlines,
landlines, and you know, people arguing about whose property is whose. I got my fence on Bill's property. Bill's no. I've had this property since my grandfather gave it to me years ago. It goes to the old dead oak tree. You know, I mean, all kinds of problems with property lines. And here's the deal: if you get a surveyor out there and you have the property surveyed, in the line, you've built your building over your neighbor's property line. In most cases, that means you're going to have to either see if you can talk your neighbor into selling you a piece of property that you've now are trespassing on, or you're going to have to tear down your building. And a lot of times that's generally what a court may order you to do. There is a concept called adverse possession. And it's rarely used, rarely successful, but basically what it means is that if you have openly and hostily maintain someone else's property for over 10 years, then you can claim right to that property. I don't think that's the scenario in our emailer's situation, but that may be what they're getting to. You have that as an option, but it's not a very successful, people aren't very successful at pushing an adverse possession claim.
We were going to talk a little bit about some of the things going on in the news and
Right.
the legal aspect of some of the things going on. So Mr. Garcia being wrongly deported.
Yeah,
Can we talk a little bit about his rights, even if he's not a citizen of this country?
You know, that's one of those things that's pretty important for all of us to remember. The Supreme Court has gone back for years and years and years and years. And what we're talking about is the Fifth Amendment. And it's a concept called due process. And it basically means that if you've had your rights taken away, then you have the right to challenge the government when they've taken away your rights or put you in jail or forced you out of the country. And that right, that Fifth Amendment right to due process, has been expanded by the Supreme Court of the United States in multiple different opinions to include both citizens and non-citizens. So non-citizens have the right to due process. And there was a fella, Mr. Garcia, that was deported to El Salvador. He was thought to potentially be part of a gang. Ends up that the administration had admitted that this was a clerical error and he should not have been deported. And so this issue has gone all the way to the Supreme Court trying to see if he can be removed from an El Salvador prison. So what the Supreme Court has now said is just reiterated, hey, look, this Fifth Amendment right does protect non-citizens. And this non-citizens do have the right to challenge their due process being, to challenge their rights being taken away. And so that's kind of where we are right now. We're trying to figure out a path forward to get him back to see if, if he was in fact part of this gang, if he can present information that he wasn't, and then a court can truly decide and he can have the due process he is actually afforded under the Constitution.
Good info.
Yeah.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. It's Ask Us Anything Night, so call in 536-0077 and we'll be right back.
You're watching Way 31 Law Call. Your rights, your calls, live. Presented by the Tennessee Valley's award-winning personal injury and wrongful death law firm, Timberlake, League & Brooks. Featuring the knowledge and experience of Attorney Michael Timberlake, Attorney Will League, Attorney Heath Brooks, Attorney William Maservi. And hosted by broadcaster and family law attorney Sharon Doviet. This is Way 31 Law Call.
Welcome back. It's Ask Us Anything night. We're taking your calls on everything from car accidents to medical malpractice. You can call in 536-0077. You can also text us at that same number, and we've got some text questions that have come in. Okay, so here's this one. I have a will leaving all to my adult children, got a power of attorney and a medical proxy. How do I know if I also need a trust?
You know, I have a 10-year-old, and my wife and I talked about this at length. When you have a minor child, are you going to leave your property to somebody who may not be capable of taking care of the assets, or maybe not a minor, maybe somebody's 19, 20 years old, and you know, if something happens to you and your money's going to go to that person, maybe it's your child or niece or nephew or whatever. You don't want them to have all that money, then you set up a trust, and you can direct how that trust works, and you can direct who is going to be in charge of that trustee, called a trustee. And so what generally happens is that when you pass away, if you pass away, and you leave money that is through your will, then that money can go directly into a trust, and then that trust will only pay out when the person you're leaving your money to gets old enough to get it, 30 years old, 35 years old, maybe
when they've
older.
got some sense.
Correct. You don't want to give 18, 19. So in answer to that question, most of the time, people like me probably don't need a trust. There are other times when you may need a trust, like if there's a large family holding, like if there's a whole bunch of property and multiple people in the family have the property, you may establish a trust in case you pass away that benefits the whole family. That can happen. That's something that I've seen. But it's really going to be dependent upon, one, the type of people that you're leaving your assets to, and two, what are your assets? Do you have a lot of land? Do you have a lot of houses? Do you have a lot of real estate? And those kinds of things are going to be dependent upon, are going to determine whether or not you need a trust.
Good deal. We've got a caller on the line with a question about illegal immigration. Caller, thanks for calling in tonight. What's your question?
Is this Sharon?
It is. Hi, good evening. How are you?
Good. Sharon, I've called in before, but I've never said anything about my former positions. I was a federal employee for 23 years. I served half of that as an FDA investigator and the other half as an immigration officer, so I'm very familiar with these two problems.
Thank you for your service on doing that. So you've got some insight into what's going on.
I'm not a millionaire either, contrary to what the current president says. But anyways, the I-864 form is required for sponsorship into this country. And that form, when I was in there giving out green cards, was not being enforced. Another requirement is you have to speak English passably. As you see, there's many of these people that are here in this country that claim they're here legally and came across legally. They don't speak English. But by far, the biggest perpetrators of breaking into this country are people that overstay their visas. And I don't understand why that's not being enforced, and those people aren't being rounded up, because when you apply for a visa to this country, you have to give information, where you're going to be, somebody to contact here. There's all kinds of ways to get a hold of these people, and yet they're doing nothing about it. The second thing I want to say is I was an FDA investigator, and the largest district in the United States was in New York City. Anything that's going to happen is going to happen there. And we were understaffed there, and we were understaffed nationwide, because everything from bug spray to dog food is covered by the FDA and everything in between. I was responsible for methadone clinics, blood banks, medical devices, radiation, all of that stuff. And to have some imbecile put in charge of that has absolutely no education in medicine, science, or anything else is just disastrous to this country, especially when it comes to vaccines and other type of preventative measures to keep the population safe.
Remy, you've called in before. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being a loyal follower and appreciate your insights.
Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts, Remy. And one of the things that I think you've addressed a lot of issues there, first is dealing with immigration problems. Obviously, it sounds like you have been in the ball game, and there are some issues that certainly do need to be addressed. One of the things that I was pointing out is that when you have overstayed your visa, or when you have not met the requirements and have illegally entered this country, one of the things that is afforded and probably we don't have enough resources to handle is that due process, that hearing that you have to then force a removal from the country. And that's one of the things that the Supreme Court, and what I was talking about, is just indicated, is that, yeah, you do have a right of due process. Now, in terms of lowering the employment levels with the FDA, putting people in places that are not qualified for their positions, that's one of the things that we need to make sure cannot happen.
We got this text question in, and see if I'm reading it right. So, sister-in-law got on my stepdad's account and moved all his money into a CD in only her name. Stepdad wants, and his will says, my brother and I will have 50-50 of everything. What can I do? Okay, it doesn't sound like stepdad has passed away, so it sounds like stepdad is still with us. I think that's going to be stepdad needs to take some actions, or if stepdad is not competent. If stepdad can go, if the sister-in-law has done something illegal against his wishes, that's one thing. He could take action.
That's true.
If he's not competent, then you may need to be talking about getting a conservatorship.
Important thing about a will to remember, very important thing about a will to remember, is that a will is a potential right in something. So, if I have however much money I have, and I want to leave that all to my daughter, and when I pass away, the court's going to open up. I'm going to have to go down to the court. I'm going to have to, I'm not going to go down, but my family's going to go down to the court. They're going to take my will. They're going to give it to the probate judge, and it's going to be probated. And then all the people that I owe money to are going to come, and they're going to try to collect off of my estate. And so at the end of the day, although I want to leave my daughter all of my money, if all the people that I owe money to take all my money and there's nothing left, then my daughter doesn't get anything.
Yeah.
So a will is a potential asset that you have. And until you end up passing away and your affairs get sorted out, nobody in the will has any real rights. The concern that I've got is that if you have a situation where another family member without legal right is moving money around, then that's something to be concerned about, particularly if the family member is infirm or doesn't have the disabled for whatever reason, maybe dementia. So that's something that you may question. But the sister-in-law may have a power of attorney to do that.
Right.
So may have the legal authority to do that. So with that, remembering that the right that you have in a will is a future right and not dependent upon what happens prior to somebody passing.
We got this email question from Kylie. Kylie says, if I decide to seek legal help for my car wreck settlement, how long does it usually take? Because I need the money right now.
That's a loaded gun question.
How long does it take?
Everybody's is different. And I get that question in almost every single case that I take in. How long is this going to take? What am I going to end up getting? What all do I have to do? And you really have to take each case separately. You have to take account of who the insurance companies are, what are the facts of the case, who the defendant, who is the actual wrongdoer in the case, and in the claim. How bad are your injuries? How long is it going to take you to recover? How many medical bills do you have? Are you off work? Those are the kinds of things. Who are your medical providers? Those are the kinds of things that can go into determining how long is it going to take to resolve your case. One of the things I always say is that, if somebody comes in and they've got a shoulder injury, maybe they have a rotator cuff tear, maybe they need a surgery, maybe we don't know yet. But we don't want to run out and settle the case without knowing whether or not they need a surgery, because once you've settled a case, you've settled a case. So if you've got to go through, most of the time when you're going through a shoulder issue, you go to the doctor refers you to an orthopedic surgeon. The orthopedic surgeon takes a look at your shoulder, maybe sends you to therapy. If that doesn't work, maybe gives you some injections. If that doesn't work, MRI and a potential surgery. So there is a long number of months to go between wreck and actual surgery and then the recovery from that surgery. So sometimes these cases can take years to resolve depending upon the injury.
So do you have people that are having to go into bankruptcy in the meantime because they can't meet all their bills?
That's one thing that we really try to work on. A lot of times we can contact the medical providers and say, hey, look, we're involved in a claim. Can you hold off for a while? Can you let us see if we can work this out? A lot of times most providers really will work with us to make sure that happens.
Okay, text question in. I bought a used vehicle from a dealership in last May. It's now broken down and undrivable due to a factory defect that caused the car to catch fire. The repair is over $8,000, way more than the car's worth. The model was recalled, but the dealership didn't inform me of that. And it was an as-is purchase. Do I have any recourse?
You know, you may actually have recourse there. One is you may have recourse against the manufacturer of the vehicle. If the vehicle was recalled, then, you know, and it wasn't ever repaired, then you may be able to have the vehicle replaced by the actual manufacturer in that kind of scenario, particularly if the subject of the recall is what caused the car to catch on fire. So that's really the first place I would look. And then the other thing is you may have a claim against the dealer, because the dealer specifically gets notifications of those recalls, so they may have been aware, and they do have a duty to not sell a vehicle that's been recalled. Sure.
We're going to take a break. Be right back, answering more of your questions for Ask Us Anything Night. Stay with us. If you didn't get your questions answered tonight, here's how to get in touch with Heath Brooks. He's with Timberlake League and Brooks. They are personal injury attorneys, so everything from car accidents to medical mistakes. 256-536-0770 or 800-804-2502. The website is law-injury.com. And if you like them on Facebook, you can learn more about the law that way.
And Sharon does family law. That's anything from divorces to child custody, adoptions. She can be reached at 256-539-7337 or www.sharonfamilylaw.com.
Remind people about time limits for these cases and problems they have.
You know, we have that happen. People come in, they're past the time period. We have to tell them, look, in the state of Alabama, you got 2 years from the date of your injury to bring your action. If you haven't settled it or filed a lawsuit, it's done. I practice law up in Tennessee too, and that's 1 year.
Ooh.
And it's strict.
You got to get to it.
That's right.
Miss your deadline and it is over.
That's right.
Thanks for your questions, and we'll see you next week.
Have a good night.